Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this to another level.
How things occur for us is always a product of that inner meaning making, that inner sense making machinery, that operating system that's running all the time. And for the most part, we're unaware of it.
All right. So, who is Michael Hamman?
Question I ask myself every day: who am I, and why am I here? But let me give what it seems to be the case at the moment is. So I've been around in the Agile world since pretty much the earliest days. Not long after the Agile Manifesto was signed, probably right around that time, I started coaching small teams and small sort of startup. My big thing was helping startup companies get going and create really cohesive team environments. And so Agile became a part of that. And I had a background in organization development and philosophy and systems thinking, and then I had also been trained as a professional coach. So I had that sort of background that I came into it with, and so my bias, of course, was the human aspect of things, and how to create environments that support human complexity of mind and human complexity of interaction. And given the complexity of the work, it seemed appropriate at the time. So that's been my emphasis all along, even as I was doing enterprise level coaching and consulting. It was really a big part of it was how do we grow human capability so that people are able actually to take on and enact the sort of practices that we ask them and mindsets that we ask them to adopt. So that's been my focus all along, and wrote a book called Evolvagility a couple of years ago, and done a bunch of other things which people can find out more on LinkedIn or wherever.
Yeah, you've contributed a lot to the Agile community, so I want to personally thank you. But I think I wish more people knew about your work and what you're doing. So maybe you mentioned your book. So in what ways do you consider your book, your work, to be about leadership? Could you maybe talk about that?
Sure. So from the very beginning, a big part of what I did has been to coach and mentor managers, leaders, executive leaders. And what I started to see was that the most evolved leaders, the leaders who were the most effective, would often say that that they wish that more people could see things in a more complex way. In other words, they wished that there were more leaders in the organization, people who could become more leaderful. And at the same time, the less effective leaders just simply couldn't see it, couldn't see that. And so what I started to surmise was that leadership is not just a top level thing. It's not just associated with that positional role, although that's an important part of it. But leadership, especially in a VUCA world, is necessarily a systemic phenomenon. It's a systemic capability. And especially if you start to understand the notion of leadership, not like the big L leadership, the capital L leadership with which we associate like positional leaders, and which is how most people talk about leadership. But rather than that, small L leadership, which is the notion that at any moment leadership is being called for, and anybody can step forward at such a moment and bring their own leaderful qualities to bear in that moment, appropriate to, to who they are in their leadership. So leadership as a systemic phenomenon, and that's the notion of leadership that a book, Evolvagility, really presupposes.
Great, yeah, and I'm interested to hear, like, what from your perspective, what's missing in current organizations? A lot of times we talk about predict and plan, and in your book you talk about sense and respond. What is the shift, and then what is sense and respond, and how is it different than predict and plan? Because we talk about these things, predict and plan, agile is a sense and respond, but what does that mean to you? And maybe if you could share the way that you describe it in your book.
Yeah. So, well, predict and plan and sense and respond refer not necessarily to what we do. So this is not about saying no to planning or even predicting. And nor is it saying yes to only sensing and responding. So this is not like, we've got to get rid of all the planning and all the predicting and we're just responding, we're just sensing and responding. It's a more dialectically nuanced notion than that sense and respond is a kind of mindset. It's a way of making sense of the world, a way of making meaning, in which we no longer rely on the predictive nature of reality. So for the most part, we as human beings understand the world innately as that which we can predict and that with respect to which we can make plans. And when the predictions don't pan out and the plans fail, we become upset. And it's really a product of the Newtonian metaphysical worldview that we've all been born into, that we all wake up into every day.
Conditioned into, yeah.
Huh?
Conditioned into.
Yeah, it's even beyond conditioning. It's like preconditioning. It's like we got born into it, like a party that got started long before we came along, and we find ourselves in that party, and we don't know that we're in that party, but the party that we're in, or the sort of metaphysical cultural environment in which we find ourselves in, is one that presumes a kind of causal linearity. And underlying that or expressing that is this notion that given certain circumstances or certain things that we can observe, we can predict, and then on the basis of that prediction, make plans. And that is essentially a mindset. It's a quality of meaning making that is there in the background. And for the most part, most of us live in that sort of land, that territory of metaphysical assumptions. Sense and respond is a different operating system, you could say. So that predict and plan is a kind of operating system that worked pretty well, or it seemed to work pretty well in a pre-VUCA world, in a world that was apparently more predictable and more stable, but it's no longer an able operating system in the face of the unpredictability, the volatility, the uncertainty, the ambiguity that is characteristic of today's world, all of which calls for literally an operating system upgrade, an operating system in terms of our consciousness, in terms of our sense-making capacity, an upgrade in the complexity with which we're able to make sense of the world. And that upgrade moves into what I have been calling, and other people call it this, by the way. I haven't coined the term, but sense and respond. Just to add one last little piece to that most people, when they talk about sense and respond, they talk about organizational capability, like having structures and systems and processes and all of that renders companies better able to respond to change, in the kind of lean startup way of understanding that. And the way that I use the term sense and respond is closer to the way that I've been describing it here, which has to do with consciousness, which has to do with individual and collective sense making. And the premise in this work is that we can't really have business agility, not really, until we can get to human systems and consciousness or inner agility.
That's a very interesting. So I definitely want to talk about in and out of agility that you describe in your book. But before we jump to that, maybe just to spend a little bit more time on this predict and plan, sense, and respond. And what it reminds me of is Canadian framework. And when we look at complicated environment or domain and complex domain, as Dave Snowden describes it. So what you were saying is, in terms of operating systems, the predict and plan is operating system a lot of times for that complicated environment. And yet maybe the way to look at predict and plan is an operating system for complex type of environment. So it's not necessarily, I think it might be important to distinguish that, neither one or the other one is better in a way. It's just more, it's context dependent. One predict and plan deals pretty good when you have stable situation, when things are, when you can predict and plan. But when we try to apply operating system or predict and plan when things are complex, that's where we see the disconnect. And I think that's what you see in organizations when they're trying to be predictable, or even funding. I mean, one of the things like that I see in organizations is like fundamentally how the finance and budgeting works needs to change, because you can't really predict what your budget is going to be for next year as well as you could maybe when the environment was a little bit more stable. So could you maybe from your perspective share and tie in the differences between those two, and does what I just shared regarding the Canadian make sense?
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And I've long been inspired by David Snowden's work, and there's a commonality in some of our terminology. I use the term sense making a lot. I believe I use it in a different way than he does, and and yeah, the difference between complicated and complex, that to operate in a complex environment presupposes that we're able to dance with the moment, whether you're looking at it from the point of view of like, budget, for instance, use that as a kind of an organizational example, like a sense and respond budgeting process would be one that is far more flexible, far more adaptable, more kind of operating in an emergent plan sort of paradigm. And similarly for minds which are operating in a sense and respond capacity are able to adjust themselves very quickly to what's going on in the moment. Now, the thing that I want to be really clear about is that sense and respond, to use Ken Wilber's terminology, sense and respond is an operating system capability. It's an inner operating system capability that transcends, you could say that it transcends, but it also includes the capability given by predict and plan. So this is not about throwing out plans. It's not about throwing out predictions. It's literally adding a new dimensionality. So if predict and plan is a kind of two-dimensional world, sense and respond just offers us the Z plane or the Z plane. It offers us a third dimension that we're able to add, and it allows us to see the greater complexity.
Mm-hmm. That's really a couple of things that come to mind is regarding to sense responding. When you said it's, things that I thought of as feedback loops. In a sense, we're making, through that sense and responding, the feedback loops are a lot quicker. So even for finance, to keep the same example, like we want to know if we're spending money on the right outcomes sooner than what we did, like, where we have annual plans. So like if we're off track in 2-3 weeks, we want to make sure that we're making better sense of what's going on, and that we can readjust our funds to something else that's creating better outcomes, rather than waiting 5 months later and saying, oh shoot, we wish we knew that 3 months ago or 5 months ago.
Yeah. So I want to debating. There's a way in which I want to drill down into that, but I also want to, but there's, let me just say something. And so, for instance, if you take something like beyond budgeting, if we take that as a paradigm, as an organization development paradigm, or even just taking the single example of what you just described of being able to have a more adaptive budget, that can be, so if that is running on a predict and plan operating system, what that becomes is a set of rules to follow, a kind of algorithm to follow, like, how do you do it? How do you do this becomes the operative question from a predict and plan mindset. And so managers operating in a predict and plan kind of sense-making capability are going to tend to regard something like beyond budgeting as a set of rules to follow, a set of like an algorithm. And chances are they're not, ironically, the way that they approach an adaptive budgeting process is going to be decidedly non-adaptive. They're going to be rather rigid. And you see a lot of this in the Agile world where people they turn Agile heuristics, which are rules of thumb, which are principles, into algorithms. And then it just makes a mess of things because they actually become even less adaptive than they were before. So this is an example of where, a difference between a predict and plan mindset in relation to like a business agility discipline versus a sense and respond can produce very, very different results.
It's interesting because, what makes me kind of think is Keegan's kind of like, book of, in over our heads. And what you're saying is a lot of times where our current operating system in organizations and our mindsets are not fit for the current complexity. And I think that's a kind of both scary and challenging thought when you look at even broader outside of organizations. But why organizations struggle is because of that mindset, predict and plan, maybe, or rather than embracing the uncertainty and complexity and trying to get better at making sense of it rather than control it. Maybe to kind of slowly get into this concept of inner and outer agility, could you elaborate on that and how the notion of inner operating system, we've kind of touched upon it a little bit, but could you talk about maybe inner agility and inner operating system, and then maybe describe how that's different than outer agility and how they're related? And maybe what comes first? Is it the inner agility or outer agility? You can think about what's the best way to respond, but I would like to touch upon that, the idea, again, from your book and the way that you talk about inner and outer agility. Why is it important for the listeners?
Right. So, well, in a sense, we've been sort of touching on that quite a lot, which is that you could say that, okay, so imagine a situation that's challenging. So I'm going to invite everybody who's watching this to imagine a situation for yourself that's challenging. So like for you, there's probably challenging situations that you're dealing with, probably a lot, if you're like a lot of people, right? There are situations that are challenging. And I would invite you to consider, and since this is not a workshop, we're not going to unpack this, but I'm going to just invite you to consider, kind of in the spirit of an assertion, that there is no, situations are not inherently complex. They are not inherently challenging. What makes them complex, quote unquote, or what makes them challenging is the way in which they occur for us, the way in which they occur within the environment of our sense making. So you could say that on the one hand, you could say that our sense making, and by sense making now, so we're getting into the nature of mind, of the human mind, or minds in general, but we're talking about human minds. The nature of the human mind from a certain perspective, from the perspective of people like Bob Keegan, who you just mentioned, and a number of other researchers in the area of human development. They describe the mind as a meaning-making machine, that at every moment, literally millisecond by millisecond, stuff is coming at us. And there are a series of mental operations that are ongoing almost constantly, that are parsing what's going on and rendering a kind of sensibility to what would otherwise be massive chaos of impressions and sensations and perceptions. And so the whole mechanism, any biological mechanism, is essentially its experience of the outer world is always a product of its inner structure of perception, of conceiving, of sense making. I mean, that's as true of single cell bacteria as it is of us as human beings. It's just that we have, far more complex instruments for doing that. But the basic idea is that the way things happen for us is they happen in relation or as a product of how we make sense of them. So that's the first thing that I would want to say in distinguishing inner agility. So we're just talking about the nature of inner sense making, and what I'm saying is that how things occur for us is always a product of that inner meaning making, that inner sense making machinery, that operating system that's running all the time. And for the most part, we're unaware of it. And yet we make decisions.
So let's maybe take an example of a leader, let's just say, that has an operating system, that inner operating system, where they like control, or they don't see anything wrong with control, and essentially doing anything to make profits for the company, right? How could you maybe talk about that type of perspective and that type of operating system? What type of impact might it have on the organization in a complex environment? And so, I'm not sure if I think you understand the question, but what I'm getting at is if we're running that operating system that doesn't match, if you have a leader that's running operating system, inner operating system that doesn't match the environment or complexity of the situation.
Yeah. So that's a actually great example that it's often the case that all of us, not just managers, but let's just take that one example, that a manager whose operating system is that which wants to control things. That's what you're talking about here. Someone who's oriented around a psychological need to feel in control.
Who believes that that's the right thing to do. From their perspective, they don't see nothing wrong with that.
That's right.
However, the way that when you look at organizational success, for instance, or organizational agility, or whatever you want to call it, it's not translating to what the organization needs. So it's also the leader with the operating system that doesn't match the environment, but also doesn't match what the organization needs in that context.
Yes.
Which is what we see all the time in organizations. So I'm trying to depict that example, maybe just to explore it a little bit together.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is that um, it's interesting how how an apparently simple question is complex, but let me just kind of address it somewhat a little bit simply. That someone for whom they have a concern for being in control, for controlling, will oftentimes be attracted to ideas that promote the benefits, that extol the benefits of control. And so they may even have a philosophy why control is better. So there are a lot of managers, for instance, who say, yeah, let's do Agile, but let's do it in a way that's consistent so that all the teams are doing it the same way. That would be an example of somebody like that, right? And for somebody like that, somebody operating in that operating system, to suggest, for instance, that teams decide more or less what's the best way for them to work. That assuming, for instance, we could have an agreement that the teams are actually producing results, both with respect to business results and with respect to results that are important for the operation of the organization. And but for a manager like that, that would appear as nonsense. Like the kinds of things that we would be asking him or her to consider would appear for them as nonsense. Like if we ask them to say, go to the teams, let them decide, let them choose, empower the teams. They might understand empowering the teams as, let's give them, let them have some choices, but when the push comes to shove, I'm going to have the final say. And so that would be an example of somebody who's literally not able to see. They're not being woefully recalcitrant. They're not being woefully uncooperative. They're not even resisting. They just simply don't see it, because the meaning-making constitution from which they make sense of the world is literally they cannot see certain things. And so what we're able to see and what we're not able to see, literally see, sense in front of us, is a product of the sense-making apparatus.
So maybe to make fun, I had Dean laughing on my podcast here too, and I have maybe just to make fun of SAFe, but is it so we can't blame people that go with SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, because for them SAFe creates that sense of predict and plan. They create in their own perspective. It's a great framework when they, from their perspective, that addresses what they think the problem is. So when we have leaders, for instance, it doesn't matter if it's SAFe, I'm just joking, but in a sense, like when something resonates with people, like a framework, and a leader doesn't truly embrace or doesn't fully see it from a sense and respond or complex environment, something like a SAFe framework, in their opinion and from their sense making, is a great fit for their organization, because now I have portfolio management, I have program, I have team level, I have the agile aspects of it. So is that an example of just mismatch in operating systems, and maybe perhaps indicative of what type of inner operating systems we have in organizations from a leadership standpoint in relation to why SAFe is so popular and maybe less popular frameworks? I don't know, like LESS or even Sociocracy 3.0 and some of the patterns within that are not as popular as SAFe. And yet I think many would argue from complexity standpoint, those pattern-based frameworks might be a better way to deal with the complexity of the organizations. So is there a correlation there between operating system and what comes through as far as what's applicable framework in an organization?
Well, as is true of any operating system, whether it's one that lives within us or lives on our phone or laptop, certain applications are a better fit. So safe, you could say, I'm not going to say this necessarily. You could say that safe is a more attractive item for someone operating with a certain kind of sense-making capability, one which you could, for instance, describe as having aspects of predict and plan. But I wouldn't say that safe itself is a predict and plan tool.
Yeah.
I could well imagine, and I'm almost certain it's the case, that safe in the hands and in the minds of people operating more from a sense and respond capability, i.e. a more complex sense-making capability, would probably be able to take safe as a tool and render it in a way that is highly adaptive and that is highly tuned to the organizational drive to become more responsive in its business environment.
That's probably one of the best. I really, really like what you just said, and it's making me think, because it's exactly that, right? Somebody would sense and respond or more with I guess greater inner agility and sense making would see the underlying patterns of those practices within the framework, and they would be able to contextualize those practices and patterns within the framework to the environment where somebody that doesn't have that sense-making ability would just literally try to apply it without being able to contextualize.
Right, exactly. So to your point, the person operating with a more or less predict and plan mental orientation would be more likely to see the safe methodology as a set of rules to follow, right? And whereas somebody or some group of people who have a greater complexity of mind would see it more as a set of patterns that they could interpretively engage with, and so the actual application of the tool is a product of their interpretive engagement with the tool, not so much a rule-based application of the tool itself. Like there are people who could see in SAFe, a beautiful pattern language. I mean, it's possible to view SAFe that way. It just depends on your own sense making, where you're coming from a sense making perspective.
And sense making, in a sense, it's almost like how we translate things, right, in our head. Because you could look at the same thing, like safe, but different inner operating systems may translate it differently, and then you make it different based on that translation. You're making different sense of it. So maybe I would like to maybe now spend a little bit of time of like this. We talk about sense making, but you talk about deliberate sense making. So what's the difference between sense making and adding deliberate to it? I mean, I think I obviously know, but I think it's important to make that point on the podcast as well. Because it's deliberate is intentional, right? You're intentionally making it.
Yeah. So it's a deliberate term, deliberately chosen term. Well, it points to it accounts for the fact that if we go back to what I was suggesting a moment ago about the nature of the mind as understood through the lens of adult development psychology, that at any given moment, just to reprise this point, at any given moment, we're making sense of what's happening around us. So, and you could say that for the most part, certainly when it comes to social and situational reality, that much of what is happening around us is a product of that sense making. And just to reiterate the point that that sense making is not something that we're aware of. It's not even, you can't even really say that it's something that we do. It's something that does us, that sense making, it operates in the background, and it literally parses our experience moment by moment, such that the experience we have is a product of that sense making. So just to kind of reiterate that point. So sense making always is, it's always happening, whether it's within each of us individually, collectively, groups, cultures, organizations, whole societies, we are all engaged in sense making. And for the most part, we're not aware or conscious of the nature of the sense making that's literally determining our experience, and of course, then determining our actions and interactions and all that. So that's sense making, that's the givenness of sense making. That's what's given for us. Deliberate sense making happens when we can recognize, first of all, we recognize the nature of sense making as that which is a kind of a, like a machinery. It's like a sense making or meaning making machine. And when we can engage in practices that help us become more aware of that sense-making apparatus, either shortly after it's produced its results, or better, while it's producing its results. And so deliberate sense-making refers to a body of practices that allow us to become more aware of the sense-making that is determining our experience, determining what we're sensing, what we're aware of, whether individually or collectively. So deliberate sense making is about being more deliberate. So to the degree, I'll finish this in just a moment, that to the degree that we can become aware of the sense making program, if you will, that is running us, we can then start to become more choiceful in the sense making that we engage in order to make decisions and take action.
It's making me think of a couple of things, and maybe to dive into the human development, because what I'm interested in, maybe if you could describe human development, and then I want to, or from your perspective, the field of human development, how figures in all of this. And then maybe I want to explore the sense making within the human development, because what I'm interested to hear from you is when it comes to being aware of and deliberately making sense, can somebody, or is there a difference the way or at what capacity predict and plan type of person? Or maybe like just to tie this for people that are familiar with Lou's work too, we're talking about, typically the orange or green or teal. And if you're familiar with Bill Joyner's work, we're talking about, different types of eds. But could you maybe just talk about how the field of human development figures into this? And then I have a couple of follow-up questions to that.
Sure. Yeah. So so just to say a little bit what I would say about how I view human development. Human development is a field of research that examines the nature in which human beings make sense of their world, and meaning making is a more common term in the human development world. So how humans make meaning of reality around them on the basis of which they take action. And so human development operates on the notion that much of what constitutes reality, certainly social reality, is constructed. It's not found, it's made, as Robert Keegan often likes to say, that what happens around us, the world around us, is not that which we find, it's that which we make. And so that's one of the foundations of human development. And then there's another, so that's like a foundational idea of human development. And there's a second foundation of human development that I want to just leave some space for you to respond to what I just said.
it made me think of, like, the idea that there is no single two, or there's no two people on this earth that they see the world exactly the same way, right? We all may have seen it in similar ways, but you and I may have, very similar, or maybe even the closest people to you, but there's no single way that we perceive or see the world. And I think that points to what you just said, which is that it's all in our heads. Everything that is made up and what we think and what we perceive the world to be happens in here. And there is, how many people are on earth, that many versions of reality, what reality is. And just that's just an interesting concept, because most of us would say, well, yeah, there are people that see the world the same, and there's, maybe, several different perspectives. But when you think about that, there's not another person on this earth that has the exact same version of what I consider to be the world and environment. It's an interesting thought. And that's what it made me think of when you said that it's all in our heads.
Well, so I to a certain degree, that's true. And what the people in what researchers in human development have found is that that there are actually common patterns, common structures, that of meaning making. We can discern certain structures and certain patterns. So it doesn't mean that two people who operate with a similar meaning making pattern language will literally think the same thoughts. I mean, it's not like a program. It's not like a computer program. It's more like a pattern language. It's more like a way of parsing experience, and parsing structures and certain parsing patterns that are in common, and that leads to the second sort of big idea in human development. So the first one is being that we don't find a world, we actually make it, or we construct it. And so that first idea is the notion of constructivism. And the second idea is that that as humans mature, that they move through different stages, each stage characterized by certain patterns of structures of meaning making, and that each such phase or stage that a person passes through is capable of greater meaning making complexity than the previous stage. And so we readily see this in children, right? We see children move through different phases of their development. We wouldn't necessarily say that they become more intelligent, although you could say that sort of colloquially. But what we would really say is that they move through different stages of meaning-making complexity, and we can see it. And so, like, for instance, children of a similar age tend to have similar meaning-making patterns, structures, and those meaning-making patterns of children, say, around the age of 7, are different than those of a child who's at, say, 14 or 15. And the sort of the big breakthrough in adult development, and something that wisdom traditions have known for eons, is that development process continues through adulthood. And that's what's really significant about bringing adult development into the world of agility, because what it tells us is that it's possible to move beyond, to help people move beyond the stage of meaning making they are currently operating at, that may not be sufficient for the complexity that they're dealing with. So that's for me, that's the important contribution of this vast body of research that human development has given us.
So it's almost maybe, and I think this will be a good time also to summarize it, but maybe from what I'm hearing and my kind of understanding of it is we're going through these stages, or it's almost like operating system getting upgraded, And I think an important thing that you said earlier, and you just mentioned as well, that the previous operating system doesn't get deleted. It stays there, but you add on additional capabilities to that operating system.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right.
And you're able to run more apps, more advanced apps within that operating system because of the new capabilities that you created. And that's kind of where the sense making, almost like the new apps are your new abilities to make sense.
Yes. Well, you could say that the new apps are new
sense making tools.
Skills. Well, I would say that the apps, I mean, at the risk of over,
you can only take you can only take the analogy so far, but
yeah.
So could we maybe, could you maybe just summarize, like, because we've talked about this concept of leadership with the lower L, sense, respond, predict, and plan, and then this concept of inner development and human development.
Yeah, I think what I would say to sort of integrate or summarize or bring these ideas together is that you could say that and more of the research and the work and leadership development is starting to go in this direction, that leadership is as much a sense-making capacity as much as it is, a set of competencies or skills or, actions, like it's more a capacity for a way of being than it is a way of doing. And that one of the ways in which really effective leaders lead is by showing other people different ways of making sense. So they lead by helping others make a new kind of sense of things. So that's sort of that's where all of this starts to land, that if we regard small L leadership as a systemic capability in an organization that we want to develop, and if we define small L leadership as leadership that shows up or manifests itself when it's needed, and if you add that leadership, small L leadership, or any kind of leadership, is at least as much about helping other people move toward a more complex sense making, then you can see how important it is for us to bring focus to whatever it is we can do to raise the level of sense making complexity throughout an organization.
So maybe to stick with the same analogy, at risk of going too far with an analogy, it's almost like first of all we need to upgrade ourselves, be able to run those apps, and then those apps are helping us deal with the organizational challenges. But at the same time, we're thinking about how can we help others upgrade their operating system so they can run the same apps that we're running, and they can almost help others. So essentially, you have more people that are operating from these higher, I don't know what you want to call them, but more encompassing or holistic perspectives to help organizations deal with the complexity, I guess, that we face today. Is that taking it too far, or?
Yeah, no, I think that as much as the metaphor works, that's certainly a workable way of describing things. That it tends to be the case with human systems is that when you raise the complexity of mind in individuals, or when individuals raise their own complexity of mind, it tends to lift the level of complexity, collective sense-making complexity around them. It has a catalyzing effect on other people. And when the most effective leaders I've ever worked with are ones who understood this and operated in ways that would lift people's sense-making complexity. And they would do it in certain ways, sometimes very subtle, sometimes not so subtle.
It's very interesting, and maybe a couple of topics here. but like the notion of deliberate developmental minds, which is kind of related to what we're talking about, and holding environment and the idea of facilitative agents, maybe the help relating to that concept of developing others and creating environment where you could actually upgrade. Or, I mean, I really don't like the term upgrade, but in the context of software upgrades and things like that. But could you talk about deliberate, again, development and development of minds, and maybe talking about a holding environment and facilitative agents as an examples of that?
Yeah, so all of that, it points to the idea that we all know, well, it points to the idea of a deliberately developmental environment, which is very closely related to and certainly inspired by the work of Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy, especially in their book, Everywhere Culture. And the idea is that we can create conditions in a certain learning or working environment that have the effect of helping people increase the complexity of their meaning making. And Keegan and Leahy talk about this within the context of the organization. So they use the term deliberately developmental organization. In Evolvagility, I talk about it in a little bit more loosely in terms of environment. So it's not necessarily entire organizations, but it could be teams. It could even be partnerships. It could be where any sort of collective is operating. And it's based on something that we can observe in our own personal lives. So we have children, and children go to elementary school in the US, and elsewhere they have different words for this, but it's like for children, say between 5 and maybe 10 or 11 or 12 or something like that. And these elementary schools are not only endeavor to teach certain skills and knowledge and like how to read, how to write, all that kind of stuff, but you could say that the elementary school is a deliberately developmental environment, in that the very teaching of those subjects has the effect of transforming the complexity of mind of those children. So
it reminds me of, and I wish we touched on this topic, but the discussion that we've had in the past about vertical and horizontal development, the interplay between those. And what this is reminding me, what you're saying is almost like the same way that organization deliberately develop their people's skills, horizontal skills, like, hey, Michael, I'm going to send you to a coaching class. I'm going to send you to a facilitation class. It would be nice if we had deliberate development for vertical development, which is really about what we're talking about, human development in a context of those operating systems and sense-making capability. Is that type of deliberate, like where we're actually?
Yeah. I would say that I was hesitant. I always hesitate bringing in the thing about vertical and horizontal development, because but since you let the cat out of the bag, let's just let's just touch it up a little bit. So when I think of vertical and horizontal development, and I don't want to explain it right now, but it's but for those who understand the terminology, the idea here is that vertical development has to do with complexity of mind. Horizontal development has to do with our skillfulness and competency and knowledge, right? And there's a certain relationship between the two. But in my view, and this is something that I learned very much from Bill Joyner, that the two co-arise, that you can't, really quite separate them out. So, and I'll give you an example. You brought the example in of coaching, like professional coaching. When people study professional coaching, one of the things that almost always happens is that people experience a personal transformation, i.e., they experience a transformation in their complexity of mind. They're vertical, they develop vertically as they are developing these new skills horizontally. So this is a really, really, this is almost like you could say the most important point in this whole conversation, because that's the linchpin. We don't have to send people off to meditation retreats, to be able to help them grow vertically. We can do it within the very environment of our workplaces. But the way that we do it is that we reconstitute the way in which we do things. And so, for instance, when having people take professional coaching classes, they develop new conversational skills that translate across the board. They don't have to be used only in professional coaching situations. It helps people become much more conversationally skillful, which translates into much more skillful conversation, skillful collaboration, all of which leads to far better business results in the end. But the other thing is the thing that you get with that, what you get along with that is you get an increase in vertical development. You get greater complexity of mind, greater emotional complexity, because there's kinds of skills that to be effective at the kinds of skills you learn when you learn professional coaching demand an upgrade in our vertical sense making. And so it can be really challenging. The process can be really challenging. And in the end, people come out not only more skillful, but necessarily having greater complexity of mind.
Without risk of going deeper, but this is really connecting things for me. So like what I'm thinking is, like, for instance, listening skill. And it reminded me of 4 listening levels from Otto Scharmer, and the way that I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but it's almost like if I get better at listening skills and I develop that, that's going to internally trigger the way that I interpret things and things like that. So the interplay, for instance, just using listening skill, which could be considered horizontal, that influences the vertical kind of cognitive abilities for deeper listening, and therefore different meaning making. So I don't know if I'm just, it's interesting as we talk, like, I'm trying to connect the dots between, what I know and what you're saying, and try to make meaning of everything. So,
I actually want to say something to that, because that's, just to deepen this point. For instance, there's lots of different ways to teach listening. So we're still in this on the topic of how to create environments that not only grow people vertically, but in the same process they grow horizontally, and vice versa. So you could say that horizontal development, which is increasing skillfulness and competency and knowledge in particular areas, and vertical development, that they co-arise, that they happen simultaneously. And for the most part, vertical development gets stimulated in an environment in which, what we're really focusing on is horizontal development. So let's look at listening skills, for instance. There's different ways to teach listening. One way to teach listening is as a set, like an algorithm. Like, okay, so you should look into the person's eyes. You should follow their movements. Or if you want to do something different, you should counter their movements. And so there are all of these sort of algorithms that we learn. Say, for instance, when we study active listening. By the way, I don't want to poo-poo any of this. I just am wanting to make a point here that, like, for instance, I teach, and Michael Spade and I teach a lot of listening skills in all of our programs. And the way we teach it is it's not an algorithm like that. It's about being able to connect with another human being, to be able to allow yourself to be kind of get cleared of your own concerns, so that you can allow this other person in. And so you can see that this is a more heuristic way of teaching listening, and heuristic ways of teaching anything is always going to be a little more uncomfortable for people, because they're going to find themselves in a gap between how they ordinarily operate and how they're being asked to operate. And in standing in that gap long enough, something happens, something clicks, they see something. And the seeing of that something is itself a kind of vertical tick, a kind of vertical upshift that then allows for a different ability or a different capacity, in this case, for listening, to be able to really be present with another person. And can you see how that's a very different way of thinking about how to teach listening or how to orient people around listening than sort of the sort of algorithmic active listening sort of approach?
Exactly. No, it goes back to the sense and respond and predict and plan. Because the way that I look at it, and this is the other thing, is like knowing and ability, which is like when I'm listening to somebody, I try to suspend my own beliefs, try to almost get rid of my identity of what I think is true, and say like, okay, if I was looking through the lens of who's saying, do I truly understand and empathize with how they see the world, not how I see it? And it's very interesting. I mean, I think this is why, like, when I talk to other coaches and when we just look at Agile coaching community, it seems like things are moving down in the direction. More and more Agile coaches are going down this path of better understanding both inner agility and outer agility and everything that we've discussed here. And I think what you, Michael Spade, and everybody that, within your circle, Lisa, what you've done for the Agile community, I think, has been phenomenal. And I think what your book, Michael's book, Lisa's book, like, these are the next steps, I think, as an Agile community, or ideas that we need to study better and better practice better and get better at, because I think this is what organizations will need in the next 10, 20, whatever years. So thank you for that. I know we're over time here and very close. Is there anything maybe else that you would like to share as final thoughts, or maybe another idea that we didn't get a chance to discuss?
I feel like we've created a kind of rich gumbo. I think what I would say is just to express my appreciation and gratitude to you, Miljan, for the work that you're doing, and to for bringing ideas into the world of agility. And I understand you. I perceive you as somebody who is a stand for something, and I really honor that, because not many people are truly a stand for something. And so I really just want to express my appreciation for you and your work,